Instead, it looks poised to suffer a painful and uncertain end to its economic miracle. How do you see that now?
I'm less certain about the painful end, because at the time when I was writing that, shadow banking was still running amok. The authorities it looked like they'd completely lost control of the financial system. And it felt like at some point this thing has to break. It's just getting bigger and bigger. It's not even clear that the authorities have a proper grasp of the extent of the problems. And so something will break. But around the same time that the book came out, something changed in the system. They launched a deleveraging campaign, which is best considered really a de-risking campaign. And pretty much for the last 4 or 5 years, they've really been really aggressive about reasserting control over the financial system, disposing of non-performing loans, massively shrinking down the shadow banking sector. The amount of control they now have over the financial system seems completely unimaginable from the time that I was writing that book. So what I originally envisioned as being a painful readjustment, largely because they were losing control, or they'd lost control of the financial system, I don't see the same sort of pain anymore. But I think the reality is that the days of rapid Chinese growth, to which we were all kind of accustomed, that we had this sort of vision that China was kind of heading in one direction, and it was like that. And it was just a period of time before it took over from the United States as the biggest economy, and everything that kind of went with that. None of that's a given anymore, and it's increasingly unlikely. I think the really interesting thing about the property sector is, the government deliberately brought about this deleveraging of the property sector in the full knowledge of knowing that it would involve some pain. But I think the reality is once this is done, the property will not contribute to economic growth in the way that it did prior to 2020. And that means that by its very nature, economic growth is going to be smaller, because the authorities aren't going to let property run amok the way that it used to. So I think, we'll probably see something similar with local governments as well, who've been, hugely important to stimulating economic growth through infrastructure construction. But local government finances are just so overstretched at the moment. And if anything, they've got worse during COVID, because Beijing has rolled out all these tax cuts, which have affected local governments' fiscal revenue. The tax cuts were in effort to sort of, improve the health of small and large firms alike, and households. And at the same time, because of what's happening in the property sector, there's just less demand for new land sales, which has also been a huge source of local government revenue. So, the system, all these drivers of growth in the past, they're just not sustainable anymore. The government it clearly recognizes that, and it doesn't want them to drive growth anymore. And so there will be pain throughout the system, in ways that we don't necessarily anticipate at the moment. But I think ultimately what we're looking at is just a China that grows more slowly. And a China that grows more slowly isn't going to be sort of its ability to sort of influence the globe. And even put that aside, I think the way that we see China will radically change if it's growing at 2 or 3%. Than the days where it was growing anywhere between 7 and 10%. And so I think that's kind of what the future holds. If anything, I'm more convinced that sort of that vision of China's inevitability was misplaced. But I think in terms of how the future shakes out, I think that sort of, that sort of the ability of kind of a kind of violent disruption and a painful adjustment, there certainly still will be an adjustment, but I'm not convinced it'll be as disruptive internally as it once was, as I once thought it might be. But the big issue is, I think it'll just gradually. What's the quote? This is how the world ends, not with a bang but a whimper. I think ultimately that's what we're going to see. It's going to be more of a whimper than a bang.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for watching that video. To see the full episode, check out the box over here or the link in the description.